Hey everybody, and welcome to the fourth episode of my Launchpad tutorial series. In this episode, we're gonna go over creating samples from your song and mapping them to your Launchpad. First, you need to find a song to work with. I've chosen this song for the purposes of this tutorial. You want to download it from an official source, so look for any free download or stream links. You shouldn't really use YouTube to MP3 converters because most of the time it's a lot harder to do advanced sampling techniques on them. Once your file is downloaded, go ahead and drag it into Ableton Live's arrangement view. Okay, when the audio file loads, we're gonna see Ableton has already automatically warped it if we play it somewhere. It sounds really bad. That's because Ableton's trying to make it fit the project settings by warping it to a different BPM. BPM stands for beats per minute, and this represents the speed of the song. So a higher BPM is gonna make the song faster, and a smaller BPM is gonna make it slower. Our goal right now is to undo this warp and properly prepare the project for the song that we are dragging. We want to turn warp off. Next, we have to determine the song's BPM and then apply it to our project. The easiest way to do that, as I've actually described in my live stream a while ago, is to find the start of the drop and find the first kick. So this is where the drop itself starts. You align the song here to the start of any bar of any whole number. And now you cut this up here. You can do this by right clicking and then selecting split. I'm just going to use Control E in the future. So now that you split the song up there, you want to delete this first part. Now you want to change the project's BPM until the song aligns with all of the whole numbers here. Sometimes Ableton's auto detection will be pretty spot on, but most of the time it's going to give you a completely unrelated value. It's not something you should rely on. Usually it's like a whole number, like 150, 160. Sometimes it's 174, that's also a common BPM. But it should never be something like 131 or 153 or 162. Those are like really rare occasions, and you should double check everything if you get such a weird number. If you start listening to this at any point in time, it should smoothly start from some point. So you shouldn't have any jumps into the middle of the song. Now what you want to do, you want to move it a bit to the right, like 15 bars or so, and then you want to expand it on the left all the way. Now zoom into the beginning, and now get rid of any leftover audio. That's it, now you've aligned your song to the BPM, and now you can cut it up properly because the grid lines correspond with how the sounds move in the song. Now let's get around to actually cutting the samples. Now here it kind of depends at which instrument or sound you want to sample it at. But let's say we're going to follow the background synths. And maybe sample this melody here as well. We start cutting it up so that every clip here represents one sample that we're going to play at the press of a button here. So this is going to be played when we press one button, this here segment. We can sample this like that. So now that you've cut up the part you want to sample, there's a number of ways you can convert these into audio files that are suitable for a drum rack. The first way is to simply just drag it into a drum rack. So we have a drum rack here. I'm going to hold this button so I know where it is, and I'm going to drag a sample onto it. This is the easiest way. Not the best, but it is the easiest. This doesn't create a separate audio file, but rather it finds the region that this sample is cut up at, and it just applies that region to the whole song, so it only plays that part when you press the button. Another way is to consolidate your sample. So there is a little button here that says consolidate. If you consolidate it, Ableton's gonna create a new audio file for it. Now if we drag this into our drum rack instead, let's put it on a different button. Now we can't zoom out anymore. However, consolidating is also not very good. It's useful if you want to mix multiple audio files together, but not if you just want to isolate a segment into an audio file, because if you go ahead and isolate a segment that is not at its maximum volume, this segment is not at the maximum value. If we go and consolidate it, it actually normalizes the sample, so it'll make its amplitude at exactly 0. And you can see the Ableton's clip starts compensating for this here, but if we drag it now into our drum rack, it doesn't compensate for this change in the gain. This can give volume variations to your song where they really shouldn't happen. So if you're gonna use consolidating, you should be really careful with it. The best way to do all of this is to just go ahead and right click a sample and select crop clips. This will just crop it. It's like similar to consolidation, but instead of normalizing the sample, it just isolates it into a separate audio file. And now you can drag this over here. Another benefit of it is that you can select multiple segments that you've cut up and then just crop them all immediately, and now it's going to make a separate audio file for each of these. If you instead try to consolidate this, it'll create one audio file, it'll stitch it together, which is why consolidate is used for mixing. And now what you can do, you can drag all of these immediately and they'll get mapped here. Alright, now I'm going to have a look at the device Ableton uses for samples in a drum rack. This here device is called a simpler. There's also a sampler, which is a bit more complicated, but I'm not gonna go over it today. We're gonna go over all of the features the simpler has, and I'm gonna show you some neat tricks you can do with it. So there's a classic mode, a one-shot mode, and a slice mode. Most of the time you're gonna use a one-shot mode, so that means when you press the sample once, it just plays once. You don't have to hold it down or anything. Classic mode gives you a lot more control over how your sample plays and feels. Sometimes this is not necessary for a Launchpad cover at all, which is why most of the time you're going to be using one shot. But if you want any sample to behave more like an instrument of sorts, you're going to want to know how to use the classic mode. The slice mode is not useful to us at all because it is used for cutting up a sample into equal segments and then playing them with different notes, which is something that we can't do in a drum rack in the first place. So we're not going to be using slice mode at all. So the first thing we notice among the sample's parameters is this gain. This allows you to change the volume of your sample. There are also some other controls for changing the volume, like these here. All of the default values are pretty close to the actual sample's volume, so you shouldn't play around with these at all unless you have a specific reason to. Next we have the trigger or gate toggle. So if we have trigger, that means pressing the button once will trigger the sample once. You don't have to hold down or anything. However, if you select gate, that means that the sample will play only for as long as we are holding the button. Sometimes you're gonna use gate to improve your performance, but most of the time you're gonna be using trigger. This is the snap toggle. It's best to leave it off. If you turn it on, you're losing a slight bit of audio data here. It's around 20 milliseconds, which is more than enough for you to notice. This loss adds up over the course of all of your samples, and then it can cause your playback to not be smooth. You're gonna have gaps in your audio. Like I have here, I have gaps in my audio. So you want to keep snap turned off, and if you want to turn it off for every single sample, you can right click it while it's turned off, and then select copy value to siblings. This will copy the snap value to all the similar devices in the drum rack. It sounds a lot better immediately as soon as I've done that. After that, there's this warp toggle here. If the sample is not an appropriate length, so if it has like a weird length that's not a power of 2 or anything like that, sometimes having the sample warped can cause it to change its duration and thus change how it sounds. This is best to leave it off, and it's gonna be automatically turned off if your sample has the warp button turned off. So the song that you've been cutting up in the beginning should have its warp turned off if you want the cropped samples to have the warp turned off, and thus if you want to have the actual samples warp turned off. Here's what happens if I turn warp on and then play around with some of these parameters. You can get some pretty funky stuff to happen, and it's not always nice if Ableton automatically destroys the sample for you, so it's best to leave that off. There's also the fade in and the fade out dials, which appropriately draw themselves on top of the sample. You can use these to simply fade in or out your sample. The default values of 0.1 are actually helpful because it'll cut off this small jump here, which will make the audio file start from a neutral level. This can reduce slight crackles and clips in the audio. And last but not least, this is the transposition dial. This changes the pitch of your audio file. This doesn't seem very useful at start because it just destroys your sample, but it's gonna be useful to us in the future. Now let's go ahead and switch over to classic mode. So now instead of the trigger and the gate stuff, we have something like this. This allows us to precisely control where our sample starts and ends. So we can use this to specify a different point for the beginning of our sample. This is good because we can input a number. So if you select 50%, it's going to be at exactly the half point of this sample. Sometimes this can be useful. Most of the time it's not going to be because you can just slice it up here in the arrangement view, but it's still very nice to know about it. You can do the same with the length. And now you can actually loop the sample. So if you select loop and press the button, the sample starts looping very, very rapidly. We can even fade this loop to make it sound smoother. But how we actually control this loop is over ADSR, or Attack, Decay, Sustain, Release. This refers to how the audio's volume behaves while we are playing the sample. When we trigger the sample, the attack segment comes in first. This is the time it takes to travel from a neutral level onto a peak level of the sample. So this is equivalent to a fade-in of sorts. After the attack segment is done, we move over to the decay segment. It'll fall down from the peak level up until some level. That level is the sustain level. After another 300 milliseconds, let's say we want it to fall down to minus 15 decibels and we have it stay there. We can make this decay larger. So over the course of these 1.67 seconds, it's going to slowly go from 0 to minus 15 decibels. And this release segment at the end is the time it takes from the sample to drop from sustain back to neutral. The sample will stay at the sustain level for as long as you're holding the button down. So if you release the button prematurely, the release kicks in prematurely. Now we can use this to create a finer loop. Obviously, this is not the best example of a sample that you can loop to create an instrument-like thing, but every now and then you're gonna run into something like this, and this can really add to the quality of your performance. There are also some other parameters here in the control page, such as the filter, the LFO, and the pitch envelope. You're never gonna use any of these for a Launchpad cover, so you shouldn't worry about them at all. You should only focus on this here sample tab. Alright guys, that's it for today's episode. If you have any questions about it, leave them in the comments. I'll answer them as soon as I can. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.